This lecture continues the story from the previous one. I left you in the classic cliff-hanging style at a moment of what appeared to be crisis. The Younger Dryas, a drought settling over the southwestern Asian area. In this lecture, I'm going to backtrack a little bit here because it's important to emphasize the importance of environmental change. And I'm going to begin by describing the environmental changes in southwestern Asia after the Ice Age again in a little more detail, because this fostered changes in plant and animal populations in the region. This was the environment of the Natufians, whom we described in Lecture 13. Next, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the impact of this Younger Dryas episode, named after the polar flower, which brought intense drought and triggered major changes in hunter-gatherer lifeways in this region, including ultimately the deliberate cultivation of wild grasses. The next two segments of the lecture after that describe early farming settlements, two famous sites. One is a mound village called Abu Huraira in Syria, and the other is the famous biblical city of Jericho in Jordan, which chronicle, the two of them, the sudden dramatic changeover from hunting and collecting to farming. Finally, I'm going to describe the intensive selective hunting of herd animals, which was a prelude to the domestication of goats and sheep. As we saw in Lecture 13, the climate in southwestern Asia after the Ice Age warmed up very considerably. That is, after about 15,000 BC. Forest expanded rapidly. There was more rainfall than today, and many areas became, having been previously somewhat impoverished with clumps of food, richer in plant and animal foods. The eastern Mediterranean coast, which was to become so strategic in later history, lay at this time at the junction of various different climates. The Mediterranean climate, continental climate of Asia, and the monsoon-influenced climates of Mesopotamia and the Indian Ocean. This combination of different climates nurtured a very unique and ever-changing set of ecotones, places where ecological zones meet. These places, usually abundant in food and water supplies, were the places where human populations were densest. And again, here, as we find in other parts of the world, the climate of what's called the early Holocene, holos in Greek, again displaying my classical education. Holos in Greek means recent, which is a term used to describe the period after the end of the Ice Age, about 15,000 years ago. The early Holocene climate varied constantly from continental to Mediterranean, from drier to wetter. But initially, after the Ice Age, temperatures warmed up, there was much more forest cover, and the summers were relatively dry. At the same time, the plant cover was much more diverse, with many more wild cereal grasses, which could be harvested in spring after the winter rains. These climatic circumstances, as we saw last time, were extremely favorable for hunter-gatherer societies like the Natufians, who relied on a combination of game and plant foods. They diversified, and in many places they may, by exploiting all these different plant foods, have contributed unconsciously to the diversification of grasses by deliberately firing the vegetation in the dry season. This process, which was also practiced by many Native American groups in the Americas, encouraged new growth for game to graze upon, and while the game was grazing, you would hunt it. This was a very nice environment for hunter-gatherers. As I said last time, many of them acquired quite elaborate culture and lived in more permanent settlements. But the Younger Dryas, 1,000-year event, where in northern latitudes the climate literally plummeted back to near glacial conditions, which endured for about 1,000 years, and then abruptly the warming resumed, brought an abrupt change to cooler, very dry conditions around 11,000 BC in this area. Marked contrast in the seasons, cold winters, warm summers, but drier and drier. This immediately changed the dynamics of life in this region. Why? Forest cover retreated. For example, the site of Abu Huraira, which we'll talk about shortly, had forests within easy walking distance before 11,000 BC. But these forests retreated in the face of greater aridity, to the point where it was a major expedition to go and harvest the nuts. So many groups turned more and more to wild grasses, more open vegetation. They also responded by developing more effective ways of storing the wild harvest so they could eat it in the winter, and by exploiting the grasses more and more intensively. And one of the things they did was improve their technology for grinding the grass to make edible meal. Many of them were already living in sedentary settlements, and these sedentary settlements, which were located in favorable areas, tended to perpetuate themselves because they were an adjustment to a world with less surface water, and months on end when game and plant foods were in short supply. Just as you find in the desert of North America, the western deserts, groups tended to concentrate around lakes or in major river valleys. But they took a new step too. They started experimenting with the deliberate planting of wild grasses. Immediately we think, a big deal, a major step. Actually, it wasn't. Because, and remember we go back right to the very beginnings of prehistory, one of the keys to survival as a hunter-gatherer is to have an extremely intimate knowledge of every detail of your environment. The grasses, which are edible, which have medicinal qualities, where game feeds at certain times of the year, what the effects are of an extremely rainy year or of a dry year, knowledge passed from generation to generation. And the fact that wild grasses germinated and grew was no new knowledge at all. Everybody knew this. But until now, they'd never needed to think of planting the stuff. And the Natufians had harvested cereal grasses on hillsides and in fertile valleys for centuries. And at the same time were exploiting desert gazelle and other game on the lowlands. This form of specialized hunting and gathering was widespread in Southwest Asia in 11,000 BC. And it was very, very effective. For example, the inhabitants of the Abu Huraira Mound, which we'll talk about, it's in Syria's Euphrates Valley a little later on, hunted gazelle to the exclusion of almost any other game. Because the gazelle migrations were so large, they could cull more than enough meat, dry most of it, store it for the year. They also lived, and this is very interesting because it brings up a point we talked about before, they lived off about half a dozen staple grasses. How do we know this? Because of an ingenious technique called flotation, where you take samples of a deposit from an archaeological site and you run them through water and fine screens. And the earth falls to the bottom, but the fine screen, and I mean very fine, catches the seeds which are virtually invisible in the deposits. And a botanist called Gordon Hillman, when they dug Abu Huraira, collected pints, I mean pints, of wild grass seeds from these deposits. Think how many seeds there are in a pint. It's a lot. And from this, he literally could reconstruct the changing food patterns and the surrounding environment. And he found that the Abu Huraira people ate staply about a dozen plant grasses. But they knew of at least 200 other plants which they used for food, for medical purposes, and for ritual practices. And intimate knowledge of their environment. To a considerable extent, the Abu Huraira people and the Tufians were managing and tending their environment way before they domesticated plants. Remember last time when we were talking about hunter-gatherers, we talked about this notion of a cushion. They had a cushion. And it worked. But what happens if you manage your environment and you begin to get short of wild grasses, of the staples? Very logical thing to do. You know that plants germinate. Plant some grass seed and amplify the wild stands by expanding them and watering them. And that is apparently what they did. And that's how agriculture began. But directly they started experimenting with the planting of wild seeds, the harvesters imposed entirely new selective pressures on cultivated stands of wild grasses. They began by cultivating wild wheat and barley, which grew in dense stands in a wild state in many areas of Southwest Asia. And please do not think, ladies and gentlemen, that this began only in one place. It began in a lot of places because it was an entirely logical strategy. Today, few people harvest wild grain. And it's a pity because they have some rather unusual qualities. The brittle hinge that joins the seed and the stalk is so brittle in wild grass that you can literally tap the stalk and the grass will fall off into the basket. If, and it's a big if, you were there at the right moment to harvest it, which is a window of several days. And then you're competing with birds, rodents, and other animals. Or, excuse me, you simply cut the stalks with a flint-bladed sickle, or even uproot them and just take them away. But once you start deliberately cultivating it, selection for a tougher rachis, this hinge, it's called a rachis, began the moment people started harvesting grasses with flint-bladed sickles or uprooting entire plants. You just didn't shake the plants and go by. You did it deliberately. And you started doing this not only with your grown stuff, but with the wild. And the selective process started. And Hillman, among others, has run computer simulations which suggest that the changeover took place with remarkable speed, maybe in as quick as a century. And within a century, the hinge was so tough that you had to harvest the grain with sickles. The process of harvesting wasn't just shaking, competing with animals, it was humans doing it. We had intervened. The changeover is so rapid, he thinks, that one archaeological level may well contain wild seeds, and the next one, a few inches or centimeters above, contains domesticated grasses. Once this cultivation began, the changeover to cultivation was rapid. Why? Because you created a whole new universe for the wild grasses. That is how they think it began. And because at the very beginning, the wild seeds were the primary diet and the planted ones were just simply a supplement. to increase the food supply, to ensure that stored food was abundant enough. This set of selective pressure on grasses developed first in a small region of Southwest Asia. It's called the Levantine Corridor in the literature. It runs from the Damascus area of Syria into the lower Jordan Valley and across to the Euphrates River Valley. This corridor had reliable water supplies, a relatively high water table at the time, which enabled foragers to go to another stage here, which is to shift wild grains from their natural habitats into well-watered areas near streams and lakes, where they would create fields of this. In other words, they weren't just supplementing, they were expanding the range. This process may also have happened in Turkey. We don't know. The research on this is still at quite an early stage. And it appears, though, that many of the earliest farming settlements in the world occur within this Levantine corridor. What I want to do in this lecture is document this transition in human life from archaeological sites. And then in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about why this happened, some of the theories people have developed, and then the consequences of it. I thought it was a good idea to get the archaeological evidence down first so that we know what we're talking about. And I'm going to talk about two sites which document this transition and give us a general impression of the changeover. The smaller of the two is a site called Abu Huraira, located on an ecotone, the zone between forests and savanna and floodplain and desert, in the Euphrates Valley. A site dug by an English archaeologist called Andrew Moore, who dug it with meticulous care. It took him many, many years. Abu Huraira began as a small village of a few families living in semi-subterranean houses, partly dug in the ground, in about 10,500 BC. They had simple reed roofs, these houses, supported by wooden uprights. The climate was warmer and wetter than today. The inhabitants harvested oak and pistachios in fall, as well as wild einkorn and rye. And each spring they killed hundreds of Persian gazelles as they migrated through the Euphrates Valley, a migration as predictable as the traffic on a freeway. With such a favored location, over many generations, the village grew to as many as 400 people. It's a lot of people. And think of the crowding and the social differences which would begin to appear. Thousands of small seeds recovered by these sophisticated flotation methods I mentioned document the effects of an increasingly dry climate, of more and more dry years. Hillman was able to show that at first the people relied heavily on acorns and pistachios. As the droughts intensified, the forests retreated from near the site, so they turned more and more to wild acorn, rye, and other grasses. They transitioned away from nuts. They were too much effort. But eventually, even more arid conditions, and perhaps, and this is something we often forget about, the depletion of firewood supplies, caused the abandonment of the village. They left. They had to. And then suddenly, in about 10,000 BC, a new village rose on the same site. But it was quite different. It was a site with small houses made of mud brick, with flat roofs and courtyards, with small alleys going through the settlement, very like a Southwest nation village of today. And this time, the people weren't hunting and gathering. They were hunting and farming. And they were cultivating einkorn, lentils, and rye, and maybe other crops. And the important point is that this was so successful as an economy that the village grew rapidly in size. Within 1,500 years, by 8,500 BC, Abu Huraira covered nearly 30 acres atop a low mound of occupation debris. Then there was another change. Within a generation or so, suddenly, people gave up gazelle hunting, although they still did it. But it wasn't the primary food. They owned herds of goats and sheep, domesticated animals. Now, Abu Huraira was a farming village, a closely knit community of one-story mud brick houses joined by narrow lanes and courtyards. It was a quite different place. It was a permanent settlement. People lived for centuries. People flourished there until the site was abandoned forever in about 6,500 BC, a degree of permanence that was unimaginable in earlier times. Much more dense population, with all that that implies, which we'll explore in the next lecture. So there's one example of the transition. Then there's another. Jericho. Jericho, famous in the scriptures for the famous siege of Joshua, where he caused the priests to blow their trumpets, and the walls fell down, and every man advanced straight in front of him, and they put the inhabitants to the sword. Big, dramatic Old Testament stuff. But what isn't known generally to a lot of people is that the modern city lies atop a deep occupation mound, and some of the earliest farming settlements in the world buried right down the bottom of this mound. Very, very difficult to explore because of the depth of the site. A number of archaeologists in the early 20th century excavated the upper levels of Jericho, the Iron Age and Bronze Age levels, and of course they were searching for the biblical city. But in the 1950s, a British archaeologist, Kathleen Kenyon, who'd been trained on Roman Britain, which is a very meticulous form of excavation, probed the lowest depths of the mound using stratigraphic principles of observation of layers, which she had learnt on Roman sites in Britain. She dug below extensive Iron Age and Bronze Age occupation layers. And underneath this, she unearthed two much earlier farming settlements with substantial houses. These caused a sensation because this was in the early days of radiocarbon dating, which really came into use in 1950, and she was able to date the earliest of these to earlier than 9,000 BC. At the time, people thought farming maybe was 3,000, 4,000 BC, somewhere around there. Here it was, the time was doubled. The earliest settlement of all was a cluster of beehive-shaped huts. But what was fascinating wasn't the huts, this is fairly reasonable, but this closely packed dwellings nestled inside not only a rock-cut ditch nearly 9 foot deep, but a well-built stone wall complete with a tower. The fortifications of this village are the earliest in the world, and the village itself covered nearly 10 acres. Why on earth would a humble farming settlement like this build a ditch and fortifications? It's a depressing thought. Maybe there was war. Maybe they were fighting with neighbors. Was defense needed? We don't know, but it is a fact that in later centuries, Jericho lay astride a strategic route from the coast to the desert. And maybe they had to protect the precious water supplies of the perennial string that was the anchor of Jericho, not only as a village, but also as a city. Another theory suggests that these stone walls were, in fact, used for flood control, with floods of the Jordan. We simply don't know. Like so many other archaeological controversies, the problem is unresolved. But the fact of the matter is that Jericho is another very early farming settlement, and at the very base of the mound lies a small settlement by the permanent spring, which I just mentioned, dating to about 10,000 BC. As far as we know at the moment, and we could always be surprised because new sites are always being found, Cereal agriculture was widespread in southwestern Asia by 9000 BC and probably began as early as 10,000 BC. Didn't just begin in one place. It was a logical strategy that was applied probably in many communities who were suffering from drought. It was a logical defense against hunger. The causes were not, as we'll see, entirely climatic, but the climate contributed to major changes. The earliest farmers were settled widely in this area by 9500 BC. And they also domesticated animals. How did they domesticate animals? The immediate predecessors of the people who were herding animals were extremely efficient selective hunters. They were hunting young gazelles and other desert animals in their prime and forest animals. Now, this pattern of animal exploitation had begun much earlier, during the late Ice Age. The Cro Magnons, as you can recall, could hunt an animal of any size. They were very efficient. And this process of efficiency is particularly effective against gregarious, highly social animals like wild goats and wild sheep, who tend to follow herd leaders. Now, all these hunters had an intimate knowledge of the habits of the animals they hunted. And many of these herd animals tolerate feeding and breeding within a confined environment. And it's very good reason to believe, it's entirely logical, that hunters in a particular group would often feed off the same herd for long periods of time, many, many generations. They knew individual animals by sight. They watched them breed. They culled animals who were abandoned, and so on. And eventually, they may have conceived of the idea of controlling the movements of the key members of the herd, who would then be followed by others. Once the experience of restricting game movements took hold, it may have suggested a new way of life, and the people may have experimented with different species. As part of domestication, they may have increased their mutual dependence with the animals. Now, this process of domestication probably took quite a long time and began before 9000 BC. By 8000 BC, goat and sheep herding was widespread over a large area of Western Asia. It's really fascinating that once the idea was grasped, how quickly it took over. And we can only conclude that this new lifeway had major advantages. As we shall see in the next lecture, it also had some disadvantages. But it seems to have started, as far as agriculture is concerned, as a short-term solution to a drought problem. But the solution took over human life. And the domestication of animals may well have been the culmination of increasingly specialized hunting, where people developed these very close relationships with animals, particularly in areas where water supplies were limited and where the movements of animals, the game, were limited by the realities of water. And people just simply moved with the animals. They developed a symbiosis, a sort of living together eventually, and domestication eventually occurred. And once again, the selective pressures were such that it soon became a profitable enterprise for those who did it. And it changed human life. So there then are the beginnings of agriculture. In this lecture, we've told the story of the earliest farmers, the world's earliest, in southwestern Asia. We've described the dramatic climatic changes which made this region a paradise for hunter-gatherers after the Ice Age. Then we discussed the impact of the Younger Dryas with its intense drought cycles, which caused some communities to experiment with cereals and perhaps with animal domestication. We describe the selective processes. We describe what happened. In the next lecture, we're going to talk about the consequences.